Alright, let me tell you about this one time I decided I was bigger than nature. Bigger than the legends and the warnings of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. My name's Alex, and I've been hitting trails since I could walk. But this trail, this journey was supposed to be different. It was meant to be a week-long trek to clear my head, to find some peace away from the city's constant noise. The forecast was all clear skies, perfect for a bit of soul-searching in the wilderness. I packed my gear, everything I need to be out in the open for 7 days, and set off. The trail greeted me like an old friend, the kind that holds secrets in their silence. It was just me, my thoughts, and the untouched beauty of the dense forests of Virginia, until nature decided that I wasn't welcome. Barely 3 days into my hike, under what I thought was a lucky streak of good weather, the skies turned on me. A storm brewed out of nowhere, the kind that makes you question if the clear forecasts were just a cruel joke by the weather gods. I hustled through the thickening underbrush, the first drops of rain pelting me hard like warning shots. That's when I saw it, almost hidden by the overgrowth, a ranger station, abandoned, its windows boarded up, but offering the shelter I desperately needed. Stepping inside was like entering another world, one that had been paused, left to collect dust and memories. But it wasn't just the abandonment that set my nerves on edge. It was signs of recent habitation. A half-eaten can of beans sat on a makeshift table. A dirty sleeping bag was rolled out on a corner. And in the walls were covered in crude drawings and symbols that made no sense, but felt deeply unsettling. Every instinct screamed at me to head back into the storm, rather than spend a minute longer in that place. The logic won over. Just for the night, I told myself, trying to ignore the chill that wasn't from the cold. As much as one could in such a place, convincing myself I was alone, and the signs of occupancy were old, perhaps left by hikers seeking refuge like me. Night in a forest is a different beast, full of sounds and whispers that daylight keeps at bay. But that night, as darkness swallowed the station, it was the silence that unnerved me, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the settling structure and the distant, muffled complaints of the storm outside. I tried to sleep, but to no avail. Then the real nightmare began. Footsteps, unmistakable in their human rhythm, circled the station. Shadows flitted past the boarded windows, and voices. No, not voices, but whispers. Whispers that seemed like echoes of speech, filtered through the cracks. My heart hammered against my ribcage, every sense on high alert. This wasn't just the forest coming to life at night. Something or someone was out there. Fueled by a mix of anger and the need to protect myself, I grabbed my flashlight and knife, stepping into the outside and into the void. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and rain-soaked undergrowth. The whispers stopped. The shadows vanished, and for a moment I wondered if fear had gotten the better of me. But when I turned back into the station, my backpack lay open on the floor, its contents scattered. My map, previously tucked safely inside, now lay open with markings I hadn't made, cryptic lines and the symbols drawn in a shaky hand, altering paths and adding unknown locations. Morning couldn't come soon enough, and with the first light I was ready to leave this cursed place behind. Yet the forest had one more trick to play. The trail, familiar and marked just yesterday, seemed altered. Cares and markings led me in circles, away from the path I knew. Panic set in when I realized I was being herded, pushed deeper into the forest by those unseen forces that had haunted the night. It was a chase without a pursuer, a flight through a forest that felt alive with malice. By sheer luck, or perhaps some lingering mercy of the trail, I found my way back to civilization. Exhausted, my mind a whirlwind of questions with no answers. I've hiked many trails since then, but never alone. Never without respecting the power and mystery of nature. The Appalachian Trail in Virginia holds a secret, one I was lucky to escape. My vow to never hike it alone again isn't just a promise to myself, it's a warning to others. The trail isn't just a path through the woods, it's a threshold to mysteries we're not meant to understand. Ever since I picked up a camera, I've been drawn to the stories that don't get told, especially the ones that lurk in the shadows, whispered about in hushed tones. My name's Emma, and I'm a documentary filmmaker with a bit of a penchant for the paranormal. Maybe it's the thrill of the unknown, or maybe I just like to be scared. Either way, when I heard about a forgotten village on the outskirts of the Yorkshire Dales, rumored to be haunted, I knew I had my next project. The village, a small, almost ghostly collection of buildings, nestled in a part of Yorkshire that time seemed to have passed by, was the perfect subject. Its history was a tapestry of tales, both mundane and macabre, and I was determined to unravel it. My crew, a tight-knit group who shared my enthusiasm for the eerie, packed up our gear and ready to dive into the village's secrets. We arrived on a typical English afternoon, the sky a tapestry of greys, the air filled with a mist that clung to everything it touched. The village was exactly as we'd imagined it to be. Quiet, with a sense of abandonment that only added to its allure. The few locals we encountered were wary but polite, their faces etching stories I was eager to discover. Before we set up our first shot, we were approached by an elderly local, her back bent with age, her eyes sharp with a warning. "Stay away from the manor at the edge of the village," she told us, her voice carrying the weight of genuine fear. "It's cursed, and it's home to malevolent spirits." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, not of fear though, but of excitement. The manor wasn't on our original list of locations, but how could we resist? It was as if the village itself was inviting us to peel back its layers. Ignoring the elder's warning felt like a rite of passage, a challenge which we couldn't back down from. So that night, armed with cameras and a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, we made our way to the manor, the silhouette of its ancient structure cutting a foreboding figure against the twilight sky. The door creaked open, as if welcoming us into its depths, the air inside stale with the scent of untold stories. As we set up our equipment, the manor seemed to watch us, its walls whispering secrets we could barely grasp. We were not alone, and I don't mean spirits or ghosts, because midway through filming, we stumbled upon a group of local teenagers hiding in one of the dilapidated rooms, makeshift den of their rebellion. Their laughter and the glow of their cigarettes shattered the silence, their sudden appearance as startling as any ghost. They bolted at the sight of us, leaving echoes of their laughter behind, a reminder that not all hauntings are actually from the past. And after the unexpected run-in with the local teenagers, the atmosphere inside the manor shifted palpably. The laughter of the teenagers, echoing of the ancient walls, had briefly lifted the veil of mystery and dread that hung over the place. But once alone again, the weight of the manor's history settled back upon us, a tangible reminder of why we were actually here. The night's earlier antics had spooked us more than we cared to admit. Our laughter at the fleeing teens faded as we were left in silence, save for the occasional creak and the groan of the old structure settling around us. It was in this silence that the manor began to reveal its true self, not through poltergeists or moving objects, but through eerie ways our voices seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, the cold spots that could be chalked up to the drafts in the dilapidated building, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Our exploration led us to a room that seemed to serve as the heart of the manor's mysteries. Here, the air felt thick, charged with an unspoken narrative of years past. As we pored over old letters and diaries, we found scattered amongst the debris the tragic tale of the family who once lived here unfolded. Their story was not one of dark rituals, but one of a more earthly sorrow. A series of misfortunes and losses that left them ostracized, whispered about by the villagers, their demise a subject of speculation rather than record. The decision to conduct a seance was born out of the desire to connect with the history of the manor, to perhaps offer some closure. But as we sat in the dim light, the circle of our hands joined atop an old, dust-covered table, the air heavy with anticipation, and it became clear that the only spirits in this place were the memories and regrets that lingered in its halls. The only responses to our questions were the creaks of the old building and the rustling of the trees outside, a natural orchestra that played tricks in our imagination. Our final night in the village was restless. The manor, with its sad history and atmospheric haunts, had left its mark on us. We packed up our equipment with the first light, eager to leave behind the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The footage we captured told a story, not of ghosts and ghouls, but of a forgotten piece of history, a family's legacy left to decay, and the power of place to hold on to the past. Back in the comfort of the modern world, the manor seemed like a distant dream, a stark reminder of the fine line between history and legend. Our documentary, while devoid of supernatural revelations, offered something perhaps more valuable, a glimpse into the human capacity for storytelling, for finding mystery in the mundane, and the importance of remembering those who came before us. Reflecting on our time in the forgotten village of Yorkshire, I realized that the true terror wasn't in the possibility of encountering spirits, but in the reality of facing our own fears and imaginations in the silence and solitude of such a haunting place. The manor didn't need ghosts to be terrifying. Its history and our own minds were more than enough. Ever had one of those nights that start off normal, but end up making you question everything you thought you knew? Well, buckle up, because that's exactly what went down with me. My name's Marco, and Venice is my backyard. I mean, literally, I grew up here, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered on a supposedly ordinary night. It all started with a plan to kayak through some lesser-known canals of Venice at night. Yeah, I know, kayaking in Venice sounds touristy, but when you choose spots away from the crowds, it's a whole other world. A quiet, eerie, and absolutely fascinating world. This particular night, I was feeling more adventurous than usual and decided to explore an area of the canal system that even the locals steer clear of. It's this ancient tangled web of waterways rumored to be cursed by Venetians from centuries ago. I've always been a sucker for urban legends and figured, hey, why not? The evening kicked off without a hitch. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and the city had that serene, almost mystical vibe it gets after dark. I paddled through familiar canals with ease, the only light from my headlamp cutting through the night, guiding me deeper into the heart of Venice's shadowy past. The further I went, the more I felt like I was drifting away from the modern world and into a chapter of history that was never written down. Then, out of nowhere, this dense fog rolled in, thick and fast, swallowing up everything around me. Visibility dropped to nearly zero and the whole vibe changed. It went from serene to something straight out of a horror movie in a matter of seconds. And that's when I heard it. The singing. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it. But as I paddled forward, it grew louder and clearer. A woman's voice, mournful and haunting, echoing of the water and the stone walls like a sorrowful lament from the past. It was beautiful, but in the most heartbreaking way. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed the sound through the fog until I stumbled upon an old, abandoned gondola floating aimlessly. It looked like it hadn't been touched in ages. Inside, there was this antique locket containing the portrait of a woman who locals say vanished on her wedding night hundreds of years ago. The moment I laid eyes on that locket, everything felt off, like I'd intruded on a private moment frozen in time. The singing stopped as suddenly it had started, replaced by whispers that seemed to come from all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but the message was clear. I wasn't welcome there. That's when the calm waters around me started churning, violently, as if something unseen was trying to break free from the canal's depths. Panic set in, and every instinct screamed at me to flee, to paddle back to the safety of the familiar well-lit canals. And so I did. I paddled like my life depended on it, the whispers and the turbulent water chasing me, until I emerged from the fog, heart pounding, back to the Venice I knew. I haven't gone back to those ancient canals since that night. I've tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself that it was all just a trick of the mind, the result of the fog and the darkness, and the stories I grew up with. But deep down, I knew that it was more than that. I came face to face with something unexplainable, something ancient and powerful that still lingers in the forgotten corners of Venice. I've shared this story with a few close friends, but I can tell that they don't fully believe me. And I get it. It sounds crazy. But it doesn't matter, because I know what I experienced. Venice, for all its beauty and charm, holds secrets in its waters. Secrets that are best left undiscovered. So take it from me, a born and raised Venetian who thought he knew his city inside and out. Some mysteries are too deep and too dark to explore. And the canals at night? They're a world unto themselves. A world where the past isn't as gone as we might think. My name's Alex. I'm a college student, and to make ends meet, I started working the night shift at a small convenience store downtown. It's one of those places that's open 24/7, attracting a mix of late-night snackers and people who seem like they've nowhere else to go. In the beginning, I thought the job was perfect for me. I could study during the quieter hours and the pay was decent. But there's something about being alone at night that makes everything feel different. The store, wedged between an old laundromat and a rundown apartment building, had this retro vibe to it. Neon lights flickering outside, aisles crammed with all sorts of stuff. At first I kind of liked it. The solitude gave me time to think, to study, and the rare customer breaking the monotony wasn't too bad. But things started to get weird after a few weeks. It began with small, almost ignorable incidents. I'd find things not where I left them, like a stack of magazines or cans. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired or that a customer had moved them. Then came the sounds. Soft, subtle, like someone shuffling their feet. I'd look up, expecting to see a late visitor, but there'd be no one. I told myself it was nothing, just the byproduct of a tired mind in the early hours of the morning. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It's hard to explain, but sometimes the hair on the back of my neck would stand up, and I'd get this chill running down my spine, as if someone was watching me. I never believed much in the supernatural or anything, but those shifts started to make me question everything. I just didn't know how real things were about to get. The nights that followed turned my job at the convenience store into something I couldn't have imagined. I started noticing more oddities. One night, as I was restocking shelves, I heard the sound of a door gently closing in the back. I froze. The only door there was to the storage room, and nobody used it at this hour. I mustered the courage to check, but found nothing amiss, just rows of boxes and the faint smell of dust. I convinced myself that it was just the wind or some logical explanation that I couldn't think of at the time. But then, things escalated. It was around 2 a.m. on a particularly silent night. I was sitting behind the counter, half dozing, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper. My eyes snapped open, and I looked around, the fluorescent lights causing stark shadows across the aisles. Nothing. I stepped out from behind the counter, my heart pounding in my chest. The store was empty, and the silence was almost deafening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the quiet. No response. I began to walk down the aisles, my steps slow and hesitant. Every so often I'd pause, straining my ears for any sound, but all I could hear was the faint buzzing of the lights. That's when I saw it. A shadow, or what looked like one, at the end of the aisle. I blinked and it was gone, Just my imagination, I told myself. Just the trick of the light. But the unease in my gut told a different story. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I wasn't alone. So I decided to check the security cameras, thinking that it would put my mind at ease. I rewound the footage to the time that I heard the whisper. My hand trembled slightly as I pressed play. The screen showed me, standing alone in the aisle, but then, in the corner of the frame, there was a figure, barely visible, moving at the edge of the camera's vision. It was there for only a second, and then it vanished. My mind raced. Was someone in the store with me? Hiding? Watching? I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had to find out. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the back of the store, determined to uncover what was going on. With the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness, I made my way towards the back of the store. Every step felt heavy. My mind racing with possibilities of what or who I might find. The store was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards under my feet. I reached the storage room, the place where I had heard the door close earlier. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was as I left it, boxes of stock piled up. But something felt different. I swept the flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw it. A small gap between two large boxes, like a makeshift hiding spot. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone there? I hesitated, my hand gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. Is someone there? I called out, my voice stern. Silence was my only answer. I inched closer, the light trembling slightly in my hand. As I reached the gap, I braced myself for what I might find. But there was nothing, just an empty space and a wall. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. That's when I noticed something on the floor, partly hidden by the boxes. It was a backpack, old and worn, and it didn't belong to the store. I picked it up, my mind racing. How did this get here? Who did it belong to? And so I opened it, only to find a few personal items. A water bottle, a notepad, and a knife. The kind of knife you wouldn't carry around for any good reason. My blood ran cold. Someone had been in here, in my store, hiding in the shadows. But why? And where were they now? I realized then that it wasn't safe. I wasn't alone. I needed to get out, call the police, do something. But as I turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed from the front of the store, slow and deliberate. Someone was out there, in the dark, waiting. The sound of those footsteps, slow and measured, sent a wave of panic through me. I was cornered, the only exit through the main store, where someone or something was lurking. Clutching the backpack, I realized that calling the police wasn't an option, because my phone was on the counter, far from reach. I needed a plan, fast. I remembered the back door, rarely used and probably jammed, but it was my only chance. So I crept through the storage room, avoiding any noise, my heart pounding in my chest. As I neared the door, I heard the footsteps stop. Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. I held my breath, listening, waiting, and with the push, the back door gave way, creaking loudly. I winced at the sound, certain it would give me away. I slipped through, finding myself in the narrow alley behind the store. The night air was cold, biting at my skin, but I didn't stop to think. I ran, not looking back. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and the store as possible. Once I felt safe, hidden in the shadows of the alley, I paused to catch my breath. My mind was racing. Who was in the store? Why were they there? The backpack, the knife, none of it made sense. Fear mingled with confusion. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back there alone. So I made my way to the main street and called the police from a public phone. They arrived quickly, but after searching the store, they found no one. The backpack and its contents were taken as evidence, a mystery left unsolved. They said it might have been a homeless person seeking shelter, but the knife, that suggested something more evil. As I gave my statement, the reality of what could have happened hit me. I had been lucky, incredibly lucky, but the thought of what might have lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting, sent shivers down my spine. My name is Sarah and I'm a nurse. I've worked in many parts of the hospital over the years, but nothing quite compares to the wing where I was assigned for the night shifts. It's one of those older parts of the hospital, long corridors lined with rooms that are rarely used now, save for storage. The place has a reputation for being eerie, but I always shrugged off such talk as superstition. On my first night, I remember walking those dimly lit halls, the silence broken only by the distant beeping of machines from other wings. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that made me uneasy. I told myself that it was just a new environment and that I'd get used to it. But as the nights went by, I started to feel like the stories about the wing might hold some truth. Doors would close softly behind me, even when there was no draft. Once or twice, I thought I heard whispers, but when I turned around, there was never anyone there. It was unsettling, but I tried to keep my focus on my duties. I had no idea then just how strange things were about to get in that lonely wing of the hospital. As the nights unfolded, the sense of unease in the old hospital wing grew stronger. It wasn't just the quiet or the occasional odd noise anymore. Things started happening that I couldn't just brush off as my imagination. One night, I was making my rounds, checking each room, ensuring everything was in order. As I reached the end of the corridor, I heard the distinct sound of a phone ringing. It was coming from one of the rooms. This was strange because the rooms in this wing hadn't been used for patients in years. The ringing was persistent, cutting through the silence. I hesitated at the door, my hand on the knob, the ringing echoing in my ears. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just an old, unused patient bed and a desk with a phone on it, and that was the phone that was ringing. I approached it slowly and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" There was no response, just silence, and then the line went dead. I reported it to the maintenance team, thinking that it was just a glitch in the system. They checked it out, but they couldn't find anything wrong. They said it was probably just a one-off thing, but it wasn't. The next night, it happened again. The same room, the same ringing phone. This time, when I answered, I heard something. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, and then nothing. It left me feeling cold, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to rationalize it, such as the old building, faulty wiring, anything really that made sense. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. That's when I started noticing the other things. Doors that I'd left open were found closed. Lights that I'd turned off were back on. It was like someone, or something, was moving through the wing with me. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of not being alone. It was a feeling that would soon turn into a terrifying reality. The incidents grew more frequent, each night feeling more oppressive than the last. But nothing prepared me for what happened one particular evening. It was past midnight, and the wing was shrouded in an almost tangible silence. As I was walking down the corridor, checking each room, I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature. A chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I turned the corner, and there, at the far end of the hallway, I saw it. A shadow, just for a moment, moving across the wall. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. There was no one else scheduled to work in this wing at night, so I called out, "Who's there?" No answer, just the echo of my own voice. Summoning every bit of courage, I moved towards where I saw the shadow. Each step felt heavier than the last. As I reached the spot, my hands trembling slightly. There was nothing there, just the cold, empty hallway, but the feeling of unease lingered, growing stronger. I quickly finished my rounds and headed back to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the fear, but the sense of being watched followed me, clinging like a second skin. That night, I realized that this was no longer just about odd noises or malfunctioning equipment. There was something else in that wing, something unexplainable and deeply unsettling. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I started looking into the file of the old hospital wing. I talked to older staff members, dug through old records, and what I found sent chills down my spine. The wing used to house patients with severe psychiatric disorders, and it was notorious for its poor conditions and treatment methods. There were stories of patients who had mysteriously disappeared, never to be found, and whispers of mistreatment and despair. One account in particular stood out: a patient who had vanished without a trace, rumored to have been seen in the hallway, the very hallway where I experienced those occurrences. The story was hushed up, buried in the past, but it lingered like a dark shadow over the wing. These revelations shed a new light on everything I had just experienced. The cold spots, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It all seemed to connect back to the wing's troubled past. But knowing this only deepened the unease that had taken root in my mind. The knowledge of the wing's history weighed heavily on me. Each shift became a test of my nerves, the once familiar corridors now echoing with the hidden stories of the past. I just couldn't look at the empty rooms without imagining the secrets they held, the untold stories of those who once occupied them. It reached a point where I had to make a decision. The job was important to me, but so was my peace of mind. Eventually, I requested a transfer to another part of the hospital. The night I left the wing for the last time, I felt a mix of relief and sadness, a chapter of my life closing. I still think about that wing, the unexplained occurrences and the shadows in the hallway. They remind me that sometimes the most haunting horrors are those rooted in reality and the echoes of a troubled past that refuse to be silenced. My name is Jake, and I'm a security guard working the night shift at a large building. It's a solitary job, walking through empty halls, the silence only being broken by the occasional hum of the AC. The building, with its darkened offices and unlit corridors, always had an eerie feel to it after hours. I had gotten used to the quietness of the night. There was something almost peaceful about it, being alone with just my thoughts and the shadows. But the peace was shattered one night, when the routine I had come to know so well was disrupted by a series of unsettling events. What I thought was just another quiet night shift turned into something much more sinister, something that made me question the very nature of my job and the safety it entailed. The night started off like any other. I was making my rounds with my flashlight, just going through the motions. But then, things got weird. First, it was a door, one of those heavy ones that you definitely remember closing. It was wide open. I thought maybe I'd forgotten it or something, or maybe some late worker had left it that way. So I shrugged it off, closed it, and moved on. But then, lights started flickering on and off in the offices as I passed by. I know these lights are motion activated, but these rooms were empty. I checked, trust me, walking into a pitch black room and having the lights suddenly blaze on, not exactly fun. I was starting to feel on edge now. The empty building seemed to take on a different vibe. Every sound was amplified, like the creak of a door and the faint buzz of a computer left on. And then the noises started. Tapping sounds, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk, coming from different offices as I passed. But every time I checked, there was nothing, not a soul. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself that I was just being jumpy, but deep down, I knew something was up. This wasn't just my imagination running wild. Someone or something was messing with me, and I was about to find out what. My nerves were already on edge when it happened. I was halfway through the 3rd floor when I heard it. A clear, unmistakable sound of footsteps above me. Someone was definitely here. This wasn't just some weird light show or my mind playing tricks. I bolted up the stairs, 2 steps at a time, my heart pounding. I reached the 4th floor, and there they were. A figure, halfway down the corridor, back turned to me, rummaging through a desk. I didn't think, I just acted. "Hey," I shouted, my flashlight beam fixated on them. They froze, and then bolted. I was right behind them, my adrenaline pumping through my veins. I chased him down, and I was close, almost close enough to grab them, when they suddenly stopped and turned. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw it. It was just a kid, no older than 19, looking like he'd made a huge mistake. His hands were shaking, and he was shaking, hands up in surrender. I grabbed my radio and called it in, keeping an eye on him. Turns out, he was just a local teen who had been dared to sneak into the building by his friends. A stupid prank that went too far. When the police showed up, they took him away, lecturing him about the seriousness of his actions and calling his parents. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a strange sense of pity for the kid. The building was cleared, and I finished my shift. The night's excitement left a lasting impression. That night changed how I saw my job. It wasn't just about patrolling the quiet halls anymore. It was about expecting the unexpected. Even though the kid was harmless, it could have ended way different. And it made me realize that a sense of security can be shattered in an instant, and sometimes the threat isn't supernatural or dramatic. It's real. The summer of 2023 marked a significant change in my life. I had recently transferred to a new position in a major Midwestern city, leaving my spouse back in California for a few more months. To bridge this transitional period, I rented a studio Airbnb in a newly renovated building in the bustling downtown neighborhood. The place was small but modern, part of a secure building with a welcoming lobby. It was an exciting new chapter, and the proximity to my hometown meant that I could visit my parents just a couple of hours drive away. Life in the new city started off great. I enjoyed exploring the neighborhood and appreciated the privacy of my fellow residents in the building maintained. However, the sense of normalcy was disrupted when a new neighbor moved in across the hall. I'll call him David for the story. David, in his 60s, stood out in a building mostly occupied by college students and young professionals. His behavior was erratic and concerning from the start. David would often sit in his car in the parking lot, staring blankly into the distance. That summer, we were experiencing fallout from the Canadian wildfires and the ash dusting our cars. David became fixated on this, accusing various tenants of deliberately spraying his car with the ash. His apartment started to emit a foul odor due to hoarded trash, and he was frequently heard yelling to himself in the hallway. Concerned, I reported these issues to the Airbnb host, but my concerns were dismissed. The host claimed to have visited David's apartment and found everything in order. In August, I planned to visit my parents for their 50th anniversary. Unfortunately, an urgent work project came up, requiring me to stay in the city for the weekend. Disappointed, I managed a quick midweek overnight trip to see my parents instead. The morning after my visit, I checked my email and found a vague message from the Airbnb host about an incident involving a resident's death the previous night. My mind immediately raced to David. I opened a local news app and was met with a shocking headline: an active shooter situation at my Airbnb building, resulting in the shooter's death during a SWAT team standoff. According to the news, David had confronted another resident with a gun and then barricaded himself in his apartment, claiming he was heavily armed. He had called 911, ranting about his neighbors hacking his phone and threatening violence. The situation escalated quickly, with David firing at people in the parking lot from his window. Residents, including those in my hallway, were trapped in their apartments, ducking for cover from the gunfire. A police sniper, positioned in a building across the street, had a clear line of sight into David's apartment. In a decisive action, the sniper shot David through his window. A drone later confirmed his death, with the gun still in his hand. Miraculously, no other residents were injured. Returning to the city, I was greeted by the sight of a bullet-riddled building and emotional neighbors. People who rarely interacted were now sharing tearful embraces and videos captured during the standoff. The relief of having been away during the incident was overwhelming. If not for my work commitment altering my plans, I would have been in the midst of that terrifying ordeal. The incident left a profound impact on me. I felt a mix of relief for my own safety and sorrow for David, a man who clearly needed mental health support but instead spiraled into violence. It was a stark reminder of the unseen struggles that can lurk behind closed doors and the fragile line between normalcy and chaos. My name is Anastasia, and I recently experienced a terrifying incident while staying at an Airbnb in a quiet Florida town. We had moved to this area about a year ago to be closer with my family. My aunt and her wife, and my cousins lived just a 10-minute walk from my Airbnb, which was situated in a somewhat rural area, despite being only 15 minutes from the outskirts of a major city. One evening, after spending the day at my aunt's house, I walked back home with my two little dachshunds. The evening was cold but serene, and I felt at ease as I returned to the Airbnb. After feeding my dogs and two birds, I settled in for a relaxed FaceTime chat with a friend. We were laughing and chatting away when I took out the trash, not realizing that this simple act would lead to a night of horror. Back inside, I continued my conversation, lying in bed while my bird, who had been with my family for 76 years, started making alarm calls. I initially dismissed it as her reacting to her reflection in the window, but then, my friend's demeanor changed drastically. He looked horrified and urgently told me to go out of my room. Confused, I turned and saw the reason for his panic in my camera view. There was a man, a middle-aged and dressed in a gray pullover and dark pants, pressing his face and hands against the sliding glass door. His grin was chilling. My friend, trying to keep calm, instructed me to not look at him and go to my room. I was shaking uncontrollably, blubbering in my native language as I locked myself and my dogs in my closet. My friend, taking charge of the situation, said he'd be over in 10 minutes and call the police. I contemplated running to my mom's room to get the gun, ready to defend myself if the man broke in. Then, the tapping started. A slow, creepy rhythm on my window. My dogs began barking, and I was paralyzed with fear, convinced that these were my last moments. In desperation, I texted my aunt, who was about to leave for work, begging for her help in German. The tapping stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over, but then I remembered. I had the front door unlocked. The tapping resumed at my window, and I could do nothing but wait, praying for someone to arrive quickly. Relief came in the form of my neighbor's voice outside at 1 a.m. His pregnant wife, feeling nauseous, had gone out on their deck and had seen the unfamiliar man approaching my door. She woke her husband, who then came to investigate. I let my neighbors into the house, and soon my aunt arrived, armed and ready to protect me, followed by my friend. My home went from being a place of solitude to a gathering of concerned loved ones. The police arrived much later, taking what felt like an eternity. Thankfully, my bird was unfazed by the whole ordeal, and my dogs were just as happy to see familiar faces. Since that night, my friend has been staying with me. Even though an arrest was made, I find it hard to be alone. I'm forever grateful to my neighbor's instincts, my aunt's quick response, and my friend's support. Their actions undoubtedly prevented a much worse outcome. Three years ago, in the early days of 2020, when the world was just beginning to grapple with COVID-19, I found myself in a situation that still sends shivers down my spine. I had recently landed a new job in a small town in Texas and was in the process of finding a place to live. My sister generously offered her house, which was conveniently close to my workspace, about a 40-minute drive. She and her husband had moved out due to a long commute and left the house uninhabited. So I was grateful to move to the Airbnb, which is my sister's house, paying only for utilities and taking care of the property. After settling in for a couple of months, I had grown quite comfortable in my new home. However, one evening after returning from work, I noticed something peculiar, a cigarette butt on the curb near my house. As a smoker myself, I initially thought it might be mine, but upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't my brand. Dismissing it as a thoughtless act by a passerby, I continued with my evening. 2 days later, the situation escalated. I have found several more cigarette butts, this time on my porch. Annoyed and concerned that someone had been using my porch as a smoking spot, I cleaned them up, noting that they had seemed recently extinguished. That night, as I was watching a movie, I heard a car pass by, which was unusual given the suburban setting and the late hour during the pandemic. About half an hour later, I heard muffled voices nearby. Feeling uneasy, I paused the movie and listened intently. The voices grew closer, and I realized that they were approaching my porch, whispering now. Fearing a break-in, I quietly checked the front door to ensure it was locked. As I neared the door, the voices stopped. I decided to check out through the window, which had bars that could be unlocked from the inside. As I cautiously lifted the bars and moved the curtains aside, my heart pounded in my chest. The sight that greeted me was startling. It was a man, pressed up against the window, his face just inches from a glass. His eyes, a piercing blue, widened in surprise as they met mine. He was dressed in a nondescript hoodie and dark pants, and there was something unsettling about his gaze. For a moment, we had just stared at each other, frozen in a silent standoff. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he stepped back, pulling his hoodie tighter around his face to obscure his features. I could sense his panic, mirrored by my own. Before I could process what was happening, his accomplice, who had been lurking out of sight, began to violently kick at my door. The sound jolted me into action. I quickly slammed the window bars shut, locking them in place. My heart raced as I heard the thuds against the door, each kick sending a wave of fear through me. I dashed upstairs to the storage room, my mind racing with thoughts of what these intruders might do if they got inside. So I pushed a heavy table against the door, creating a makeshift barricade, and then dialed 911. My voice trembled as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, every noise from downstairs amplifying my fear. As I crouched in my hiding spot, waiting for the police to arrive, I heard a loud crash from the downstairs. The intruders were trying to force their way in through the window. The sound of the bars being shaken violently filled the house, followed by a long, angry scream from one of the men. It was a sound filled with frustration and rage, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. I was gripped by a sense of helplessness, praying for the police to arrive quickly. Eventually, the noises stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. When the police finally arrived, the intruders were gone. They had fled into the night, leaving behind a trail of fear and chaos. The officers took my statement and assured me that they would patrol the area, but the damage had been done. I no longer felt safe in the house that had been my sanctuary. In the days that followed, I struggled to come to terms with the incident. The feeling of violation of my personal space being invaded lingered long after the intruders had left. I decided to move out, unable to shake the memory of that night. I often think back to that night, grateful for my safety, but forever changed by the encounter. It was one of those nights that reminded me why I usually avoided the late shift. The rain was relentless, pounding against my windshield, turning the rural Arkansas roads to a blurry maze of water and darkness. My name's Jason, and I've been driving for a rideshare company for a couple years now. It pays the bills, and most nights it's uneventful. But this night, the atmosphere felt charged, like the storm was just the overture to something more sinister. I was about to call it a night when a ride request came on my app, pulling me out of my thoughts. The pickup location was deep in the back roads, somewhere I hadn't ventured before, even in daylight. The app showed me the passenger's name as Tom, with no profile picture, just a name and a location. Hesitation crept in, but the thought of turning down a fare when business had been slow all evening was just enough to push me to accept. As I navigated the twisting roads, the details of the landscape were swallowed by the night and the downpour, making me rely more on my car's GPS than I liked. Eventually, I reached the designated pickup spot, a dilapidated barn that loomed out of the darkness, like a scene from a horror movie. No house in sight, just the barn, lit by the occasional flash of lightning. I waited, the seconds turning into minutes. The only sound was of the drumming of the rain on the roof of my car and the occasional distant rumble of the thunder. Just as I was about to cancel the ride and chalk it up to a prank or a mistake, a figure emerged from the shadow of the barn. He was a young guy, maybe early 20s, drenched from head to toe, without a raincoat or umbrella. Something about him set off alarm bells in my head. But out there, in the middle of rural Arkansas, soaked to the skin, he looked more desperate than dangerous. He climbed into the front seat without a word, his clothes making a squelching sound against the fabric. "Thanks for coming out here," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he was being afraid of being overheard. "I know it's out of the way." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me as persistently as the dampness in the air. "It's no problem. Where are we headed?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He hesitated, then gave me an address on the other side of the county, further into areas I knew rarely were traveled, especially at night. As I pulled away from the barn, the sense of foreboding grew. This wasn't just another late-night fare. This was something different, something I couldn't quite explain. The rain continued to fall, a constant reminder that tonight was no ordinary night, and I was no ordinary driver. Tonight, I was driving a risk and a liability, and all I could do was follow the road ahead, wherever it might lead. As we drove, the silence in the car grew heavy, punctuated only by the sound of the rain pelting on the roof, and the occasional flicker of lightning that illuminated the surrounding landscape in brief, stark flashes. The deeper into the rural Arkansas backroads we ventured, the more my unease grew. Tom, even if that was his real name, sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the passing shadows outside the window. His initial gratitude for the ride seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a tense anticipation, as if he were bracing himself for something. Attempting to break the silence and maybe ease the growing tension, I tried making small talk. "So, what takes you out this way at this hour?" I asked, glancing at him briefly before focusing back on the road. My headlights were barely cutting through the darkness, the storm turning the night almost as black as pitch. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to mine for a fleeting moment before returning to the window. "Family stuff," he muttered. The vagueness of his answer did nothing to alleviate my concerns, though. Something about the way he said it just didn't sit right with me. It felt rehearsed and too ready. The ride continued in uneasy silence until we reached a particularly secluded stretch of road, trees looming like silent sentinels on either side. It was then that Tom's demeanor changed abruptly. "Stop the car," he said, his voice no longer a whisper, but firm and commanding. Confused and alarmed, I slowed the car to a stop, the beams of my headlights illuminating nothing but the rain-soaked road ahead. "Is everything okay?" I asked, turning to face him. In the dim light of the car's interior, I could see him fumbling with something in his pocket, his movements hurried and desperate. Before I could react, though, he leaned over, pushing something cold and metallic into my side. The realization hit me like a punch to a gut. He had a gun. "Just drive," he said, his voice steady now, laced with the threat that chilled me to the bone. "And don't try anything stupid." Panic surged through me, a tidal wave of fear and disbelief. How had a simple ride request turned into this kind of nightmare? But with the gun pressed against my side, I had no choice but to comply. As I pressed the accelerator and the car lurched forward, I realized that this was no ordinary passenger, and I was now a hostage in my own car. With the gun still pressed against my side, the car's interior felt colder, and the storm outside mirrored the chaos unfolding within. The man, Tom, directed me down an even more secluded path, one that seemed to swallow the little light we had. His voice was eerily calm as he revealed the reason for his desperation. "I can't get caught, not after what I've done," he confessed, his words sending a shiver down my spine. He spoke of a crime, a violent act that I will not mention here, but he claimed that was self-defense but had escalated far beyond his control. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air between us. I was trapped, both by the physical presence of the gun and by the knowledge of his actions. Every turn of the wheel and every mile we covered felt like a step further away from safety. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to alert someone without provoking a reaction that could end fatally. Opportunity presented itself unexpectedly, though, as Tom, perhaps lost in his own thoughts, momentarily lowered the gun as he looked out the window, seemingly trying to recognize his surroundings in the dark, rain-drenched landscape. Seizing the moment, I slammed on the brakes under the pretense of avoiding an animal on the road. The sudden stop caught him off guard, allowing me to grab the gun and shove it away while simultaneously unlocking the door and bolting out of the car. Rain hammered down as I sprinted through the mud, not daring to look back, my heart pounding in my chest. Ahead, like a beacon in the night, was the faint glow of a convenience store, still open, its lights promising safety. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and immediately told the worker to call the police. And by some sheer luck, the police arrived within 5 minutes, their presence a stark contrast to the isolation of the night's earlier events. They found Tom still in the car, seemingly resigned to his fate. The gun, it turned out, was actually stolen, and his confession in the car was enough for them to detain him for further questioning. As for the crime he alluded to, it was real, a dispute that had turned deadly, just as he'd said. In the aftermath, I gave my statement to the police. The reality of how close I'd come to being an unintended victim of his panic and poor choices began to settle in. The rideshare company offered support, and local news outlets picked up the story, but none of it could quite erase the memory of that night. The experience left me shaken, questioning the risks of being a late-night driver. I'd always prided myself on being able to read people, to gauge their intentions, but Tom had shattered that confidence. Okay, so here's something wild that happened to me not too long ago. I work as a bartender in this little dive bar in a college town. It's usually a chill job, you know, pouring drinks, chatting with the regulars, and just keeping things running smooth. But this one night, man, it was something else. It was pouring rain outside, like one of those heavy, end of the world kind of storms that just drenches everything. Made the whole night feel off, really, right from the start. Most nights I don't mind closing up alone. It's quiet, lets me get my thoughts together. But that night, with the rain hammering down and lightning lighting up the sky, I was feeling a bit on edge. So there I am, wiping down the counters, stacking chairs, the usual routine, when Todd, one of our regulars, decides he wants to stick around and help me close up. Todd's a bit of an odd duck. He keeps to himself mostly, but he's been coming to the bar for a lot of years, so I didn't think much of it. Sure, I could use the company, I told him. Grateful for the help and maybe for the bit of a company too. So Todd and I start getting the place cleaned up. Him taking the tables and me behind the bar. At first it's all good, just typical end of the night stuff. But then, as the sound of the rain kind of fades into the background, Todd starts talking. Now, I've had my fair share of late night confessions at the bar, comes with the territory, but Todd's vibe was different that night. He wasn't just unloading about work or some girl. He was talking in circles about mistakes and bad choices. Real cryptic-like. I'm rinsing out glasses, trying to keep up with his rambling, when he drops this line about how he's done things he ain't proud of. Stuff that could get him in trouble. Not just with the law, but like deep, dark trouble. My hands stopped working for a sec, just soaking in what he's laying down. The air got heavy, thick almost, with this tension that wasn't there before. Man, we all got regrets. I tried to brush it off, keep things light, but he wasn't having any of it. He kept going on about how some folks deserve what's coming to them, and how the rain, like tonight's, always seems to know when to wash things clean. I laughed, a bit uneasy, trying to steer us back to safer waters, but Tom, stuck in his loop, talking about consequences and getting what's owed. The more he talked, the more I wished I wasn't alone with him. It wasn't just the stuff he was saying, it was how he was saying it, like he was confessing but not exactly looking for redemption, just stating the facts, cold and hard. I kept glancing at the clock, wishing time would hurry up, get us to closing so I could finally lock up and get the hell out of there. As we're winding down, Tom's demeanor shifts, like a switch flipped in him. He leans in, the way someone does when they're about to tell you a secret that could change everything. His voice drops lower, takes on this edge that's both calm and menacing. Stark contrast to the storm that's now just a whisper compared to his words. You know, this world's got a funny way of balancing things out, Tom says, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking. It felt like one of those moments in a movie where the villain just lays out his grand scheme. Except there's no dramatic music, just the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of rain. People think that they can hide from what they've done, think the rain's gonna wash away their sins, but it never really does it? I try to keep my cool, keeping wiping down the bar, but his gaze is like a weight. Everyone's got their stories, Tom, I reply, trying to sound unfazed. But inside I'm reeling. This isn't just some late night bar talk, it's something else, something darker. He chuckles, a sound that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Stories, yes, but not everyone's story ends the way that they think they will. You ever wonder about that? About how your story's gonna end? The way he phrases it, it's not a question, it's a warning. My heart's racing now, the tension between us thick enough to cut. The room feels smaller, the walls inching closer as he continues. His tale is turning more personal, hinting at actions and consequences. Veiled threats dressed up as casual observations. It's like a psychological game, and he's playing his hand, trying to gauge my reactions, seeing if I'll flinch. I realize then that I'm not just a character of a bartender, listening to regulars' ramblings. I'm a captive audience to a man who's seen and done things that lurk in the shadows of his words. The sense of isolation is now overwhelming. The storm outside no longer a match for the storm Tom's words have conjured inside. I need him to get out. I need to end this night on my own terms, not his. But as I open my mouth to tell him it's time to go, he stands up. his chair scraping against the floor with a finality that echoes in the suddenly too quiet bar. "I think I'll call it a night," he says, his voice back to his usual, almost friendly tone. But the threat remains, hanging in the air long after he's gone. After Tom left, the silence of the bar felt oppressive, like the air itself was heavy with his unspoken threats. I took a moment to steady my nerves, the echo of our conversation replaying in my head. It wasn't just the things he said, but the way he said them, with a conviction that chilled me to the bone. I knew I couldn't just let it go. The feeling in my gut told me that this was serious. So the next day, still rattled by the encounter, I decided to take action. I reached out to a friend on the local police force, not sure if what I had was enough to warrant concern. He's been coming around for years, but last night was different, I explained, my voice tight with anxiety. My friend promised to look into it, to see if Tom had any history that might explain his behavior. I tried to keep to my routine, to not let the fear take hold, but the bar felt different now, tainted by the memory of that night. It wasn't long before I got a call from my friend on the force. "You were right to be worried," he said, his tone serious. "We did some digging and found out he's been involved in some, let's just say, hate groups. The dangerous ones. And we're moving in to pick him up." The news hit me like a punch to the stomach. Hate groups. The idea that someone like that had been a regular at my bar, and that I'd served him, joked with him, was horrifying. The reality of the danger I'd been in, unbeknownst to me, was a stark reminder of the world's complexities and the masks people wear. The day Tom was arrested, the bar was quiet. Word had gotten out, and the regulars were just as shocked as I was. The atmosphere was somber, a community grappling with the revelation that evil had been in their midst, disguised as one of their own. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on that night, on the warning signs I'd almost missed, and I became more vigilant, more aware of the responsibility I had to ensure my bar was a safe place for everyone. The encounter with Tom had shaken me, but it also awakened a resolve I didn't know I had. The story of what happened spread through the town, a tale of darkness that hid in plain sight. For me, it was just a reminder of the importance of trusting my instincts, and of speaking up when something doesn't feel right. The bar continues now to be a place of warmth and welcome, but with a new layer of awareness. The last call that night brought a storm into my life, but it also cleared the air, leaving behind a clearer, if more cautious, view of the world.